Hello to all of you attending today, and happy Earth Day, the 50th annual Earth Day. Welcome to our presentation, COVID-19 and Climate Change, Two Sides of the Same Coin. My name is David Whitehead. I'm representing the Nevada County chapter of Citizens Climate Education and Citizens Climate Lobby. And we're joined today by the Sacramento chapter, as our two chapters co-sponsor our first event together. Thank you to all of the Sacramento chapter volunteers, as well as the many Nevada County chapter members in the Zoom audience today. Welcome to all of you. CCL seeks to build political will for solutions to climate change. We advocate for significant reductions in carbon emissions and work for solutions directed at those most at risk in our society from climate impacts. Our nonpartisan activism includes both education for our communities as well as a presence in our local congressional district offices and on Capitol Hill. We host educational events like this one so that informed people will build political will, thereby increasing the chances that our country will take serious action on climate. We support current legislation, HR 763, the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act, which currently has 81 sponsors in the House of Representatives. Well, today we're pleased to have two noted environmental scientists, two big thinkers on the subject of climate change, Dr. Tom Suchanek from UC Davis and Mr. Dana Nuccitelli of Yale Climate Connections. They will address the complexities and similarities both of the COVID-19 pandemic and global climate change, as well as available solutions. And we're going to have three separate video presentations. Parts 1 and 2 will feature Dr. Suchanek from UC Davis. Part 1, COVID-19 and climate change, two sides of the same coin, will present scientific comparisons of these two crises. Part 2 will cover the scientific and technological solutions to climate change. Finally, Mr. Nuccitelli will present Part 3, legislative and market-based solutions to climate change. After the three presentations, we will have a question and answer period with our Zoom audience. And it's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Tom Suchanek, a marine ecologist who received his PhD from the University of Washington in Seattle. He's been studying the impacts of a wide variety of environmental contaminants for the past 40 years, but over the past 20 years, he's focused on the greatest long-term threat to human civilization, CO2-caused climate change. So without further ado, I invite Dr. Suchanek to give us part 1 of this three-part presentation. Tom?
Thank you, David. I appreciate that introduction. I would also like to thank Lou Sitzer from the Nevada County Media Center for the original invitation to give this presentation. And as you can see, I'm presenting from my home office today, doing my part to be a diligent, health-conscious citizen, protecting all of you from further exposures and providing a carbon-free presentation. I'd like to share with all of you some of my observations I have made over the striking similarities between the ongoing COVID-19 virus pandemic and our ongoing fight against climate change. This presentation will also be archived on the Nevada County Media website and through a link on my website, tomsuchanek.net/COVID, so it can be viewed on any future date as well. So let's move ahead with our evaluation of these two global crises. All right, so this is the first of three presentations, COVID-19 and climate change, two sides of the same coin. And I'm going to ask you all, should we be scared? Well, I think we should be scared. This is a very tumultuous time. And people are isolated in their homes. They have a fear of contracting the virus. There's concern for their elderly parents in nursing homes or assisted living facilities. Many are out of a job. They have little or no money for food. They stand in lines where 50,000 people are trying to get food. And their kids are driving them crazy at home. So we need to really take this very seriously. And so I just wanted to start with a little note from Ben, this little 8-year-old who's being homeschooled. It's not going well. It's not going good. My mom's getting stressed out. My mom's really getting confused. we took a break so my mom can figure this stuff out. And I'm telling you, it is not going good. And I suspect this is happening in many, many households around the country. Not ours, because our kids are already out of the nest, but in many, many households, I'm sure it's really tough to balance all those things, especially if one is a provider, healthcare provider, or other types. So here's the two global crises that we need to deal with, we need to get urgent solutions for. Part one is the COVID-19 and climate change, two sides of the same coin. Part two is scientific and technological solutions to climate change. Part three will be legislative and market-based solutions to climate change. And you can move from one to the next at your convenience. So let's start. We have two invisible enemies here that are just operating on different timescales, and we need to deal with them in much the same way. Neither one of them can we detect using normal human senses of sight, smell, taste, or touch. In the case of COVID-19 on the left, it's a virus, it's a biological agent. It's extremely contagious. It's spread by humans, and it operates on a time frame of days to weeks to months. On the right, climate change initiated by carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases is a chemical agent, very powerful heat trapping gas. It's also spread by humans, but it operates on a time scale of months to years to decades. So let's take a look at them. For both, they're rapidly increasing at exponential rates. COVID-19, as of March 22nd, there was about almost 35,000 cases in the US, and 5 days later, there was 86,000 cases, almost 87,000 cases. And 12 days later, even still, we had 400 and whatever thousand cases. I can't quite see it on my screen. So let's take a look at climate change and the emissions of carbon dioxide. This is the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere on the left. And on the bottom, this is the last 1,000 years. And for the last 1,000 years, it's been bumping along at about 280 parts per million in the atmosphere until we reached the Industrial Revolution. At that point, we started burning fossil fuels. That is coal first, and then oil and gas. Those fossil fuels are heat trapping gases, and they started capturing the CO2 in the atmosphere, and that started increasing higher and higher to 415 parts per million, and that started warming the Earth. 415 parts per million is not anything special number. It's just indicating that we're moving fast and going up and up and up and at an exponential rate. So let's take a look at some of the things of what these represent. They both represent a human physical and psychological health issue, a societal instability issue, an economic security issue, a national security issue, an environmental impacts issue, and unfortunately, also a political issue. So the world says, there's no way we can shut everything down in order to lower emissions, slow climate change, and protect the environment. And Mother Nature responds, here's a virus, go practice. And that's exactly what we're doing now. We're practicing containing and squashing this virus in much the same way that we need to deal with climate change. So let's look at the comparisons we have. So unfortunately, this is how some people think about COVID-19 and climate change. Many of them don't understand it. They either don't recognize it or don't understand what the scientists are telling them, and they want to ignore it many times. They just stick their head in the sand and try to ignore it. So I'm going to give you a couple examples. So on the left, we have a COVID example. Many of these people are ignoring what the officials are telling them. And this went on even as far as April 2nd, before Florida's governor closed the beaches where these people couldn't congregate. And many of them were spreading the virus because you don't have to have symptoms to have the virus be a part of where you are. So on the right, we have some climate deniers are also ignoring and actually actively working against it. Wayne Weeks is one of those who wrote a book, The Global Warming Climate Change Hoax. And this is what comes from many of the deniers, is an ability to just deny and exclude all evidence that's provided by government scientists or academic scientists on what the problem is. So let's look back in 2017. The Smithsonian magazine put out an article about the Spanish flu 100 years ago. And that Spanish flu was in 1918. It infected 500 million people, which was about 1/3 of the population of the Earth at that time, and it killed 50 million. That's a 10% mortality rate. They gave warnings about upcoming pandemics, and unfortunately, those warnings were not very well heeded. The Obama administration actually provided information on a warning about an upcoming or projected pandemic to the Trump administration, but this crisis probably shouldn't have happened because nothing was done in the meantime to bolster up our preparedness to face something like this. Now we're still dealing with how to best act on the COVID virus, and we're gaining progress, but it's still a slow slog right now. So let's take a look at some of the impacts from the COVID-19 virus, sickness and death as of April 10th. We're looking here at global totals, 1.6 million cases and about 100,000 deaths globally, worldwide. And similarly, global daily new cases. The United States seems to be leading the pack on this graph going up here, much, much higher than all other countries in the globe. So looking down here at the United States has the most reported coronaviruses as of the, April 9th. And very, very clear that we're leading the pack. And then I updated one slide here to look at April 16th, which the US cases are now at 671,000, and we're over 34,000 deaths in the United States. So let's look at what some of these impacts are. The economic impacts from COVID are completely involving instability and volatility, especially in the marketplace. Here's the Dow Jones Industrial Average since 2016, rising, and then a huge dump on March 16th, which was the largest point drop in history, almost 3,000 points in one day. Then the very next week, we had the largest point gain in history, almost a little over 2,000 points at that next week. Those are unprecedented, and it shows the volatility and instability in the market. Also, we have the biggest stimulus or relief package in history, $2.2 trillion on March the 25th, and we have more. Congress is looking at more stimulus and relief packages now. So let's look at unemployment, another volatile situation and unstable situation. This is again 1967 through 2020, and we have unemployment claims in the U.S. economy. On 3/26, there was 3.3 million claims. On a week later, we had an additional 6.6 million claims. On a week after that, we had another 6.6 million claims. And another week after that, we had another 5.2 million claims, bringing that total unemployment claims up to 22 million. So what the economists are projecting now is they believe that our unemployment rate might reach 17% by June or July of this year. So we'll see how accurate they are. So here's a grocery store in my neighborhood. We're looking at some of those psychological effects we talked about, getting cabin fever, causing instability, which causes then anxiety and fear and panic and hoarding. It's happening right here in my neighborhood. This whole entire side of the store is empty. No paper products whatsoever, no paper towels, no tissues, no toilet paper. And I'm not sure what's going on with toilet paper. US seems to be hoarding toilet paper. Other countries seem to be hoarding yeast to grow bread, or rise bread, or pizzas or whatever they have to eat. And our country is hoarding toilet paper. And this is the kind of result we're getting. Many people's panic rooms might look like this now. So, and also this event, this COVID pandemic, is creeping into the art world. Probably many of you know the four horsemen of the apocalypse, consisting of conquest, war, famine, and death. So this is the way that artist looked in the painting looked in the 1800s, and this is how we address that now. Seriously? Okay, it's the same thing. The United States is doing something really weird here. Okay, let's take a look at some of the impacts from climate change. We've got extreme temperature fluctuations. We have extreme snowpack fluctuations where it's, no snow one year and then 180% of average the next year. We've got extreme weather in storms, winds, tornadoes, hurricanes, causing extreme floods. Then we have extreme droughts, which dries out everything to a tinder, which then from a lightning strike or anything else causes extreme fires, which then causes the vegetation to be gone, loosening up the roots base of the plants and exposing the soil, which then causes extreme mudslides. In addition, we have rapid sea level rise. And we're going to talk about some of these issues in a little while. Increasing El Nino events, which affect our fisheries, increasing seasonality changes, both in the ocean as well as on land, and rapidly rising ocean acidification, which prevents organisms from taking out the carbonate ions out of the ocean to build their shells. And we have increasing extinction rates. We're losing about 200 species per day, not all from climate change, but it's a great contributor to that, which is about 1,000 to 10,000 times higher than we've seen with natural background rates. Then we have some scientists who are concerned that we may be entering the 6th mass global extinction, where we lose 90% of our species. So we have all these concerns, and some scientists are even concerned about increases in communicable diseases from climate change in many different situations, which we don't have time to talk about today. However, what we're seeing is extreme and unpredictable events in all of these different factors. And we're seeing them daily. They're no longer in the future where we're looking to 2100 or something that's the deadline. No, we're experiencing them all the time. In fact, right now, as we're going through the COVID virus pandemic, we are experiencing those kinds of events that are listed here. There's a 10-degree increase in temperatures on the West Coast. There's flooding in the mid-country. There's tornadoes in the south, which are moving up the East Coast and flooding areas up there as well. So this is happening every day. We just don't see as much of it in the news because COVID is taking up all the oxygen. So now we have oxygen and carbon dioxide to worry about. So, okay. So let's take a look at what's driving this climate change process here. And I think I'd like to make sure everybody's on the same page before we go start talking about carbon dioxide much. So here's the natural greenhouse effect. The sun beats down on the earth absorbs some of that heat, and some of it's reflected back up into the atmosphere. But in the meantime, we've got greenhouse gases such as carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, N2O, and methane, CH4, which are heat trapping gases, and they are warming our Earth. If we didn't have that, the Earth would be ice. Let's look at the human enhanced greenhouse effect. Instead, we have the sun similarly beating down on the Earth, heating up the Earth some, and then re-radiating back into space, some of that. But because we've produced more CO2, more methane, and N2O, nitrous oxide, into the atmosphere, that's heating our Earth even more. So that's the basis of what's happening. And we're going to focus primarily on CO2 this time. So here's a graph with temperature on the left and carbon dioxide concentrations on the right. So this is right after the Industrial Revolution, right about the early 1800s. We started seeing, and the orange is the carbon dioxide increase over time. And here we started measuring it in earnest, 1958. And this is the actual data rates here, and going up to 415 parts per million again. Again, not a special number, but means we're really high. And the temperature is more variable here. We have more data on that, and it's bouncing around, but it's also very closely correlated with what's happening with the carbon dioxide, increasing, going towards an exponential increase. So this is the basis of what we're dealing with. So the last time CO2 concentrations were 415 parts per million, humans didn't even exist. That was 800,000 to 20 million years ago. And at that time, global temperatures were substantially higher. There was almost no ice on the planet, and sea level was about 100 foot higher than it is now. So let's look at this heating up of the globe. Here's the hottest 10 years on record globally. And what we're seeing is, here's 2019. It's not quite the hottest year, but it's the second hottest year. And what we do see is that the last 6 years are the hottest 6 years. So it's apparent that we're getting hotter and hotter, faster and faster. So let's take a look at what's happening now in 2020. 2020, January was the hottest January ever on record. And our February in this year was the second hottest February on record. So we're getting hotter, and each month is breaking records of heat as well. So we need to slow this down. And the heat is causing droughts. So here is a graph from the Palmer Hydrological Drought Index from 1890 to 2018. And we have in this quadrant here, this sector, we have mild droughts. Here we have moderate droughts at this level, severe droughts at this level, and extreme droughts at this level. Well, it's pretty obvious to see that droughts are, even though they're highly variable and unpredictable, they are getting worse and worse all the time down to extreme drought. Well, they ran out of categories down here, so the people at the Palmer Hydrological Drought Index had to actually create a new category for these exceptional droughts that have occurred in 2018 and beyond. So now they have another metric to use for describing the hottest of the exceptional droughts. And the droughts are causing things to be very tinder dry and causing wildfires. Here's a graph for the number of fires larger than 1,000 acres on US Forest Service land. So we're looking at from 1970 through 2010s. And if you look down in the 1970s, we're not seeing much in the way of abundance of large, greater than 1,000 fires, 1,000 acre fires. Here's the average for those going up and up and up. But as you look towards the present, you're seeing, again, high variability in those years, but you're also seeing an increase over time in all of those more and more frequent 1,000 fires, 1,000 acre fires. And that also means that the California fire season has also increased by about 75 days across the Sierra Nevada. That's both before and after the normal fire season. So we're seeing them expanding in both directions. And we're not alone. The Amazon rainforest here in Brazil in 2019, which supplies about 20% of our Earth's oxygen, which we breathe, obviously, had over 74,000 fires. Huge, enormous fires. Obviously we see from space on satellite photographs, but that was 80% higher number of fires than they had in 2018. So it's getting worse, and the heat is enhancing that. Unfortunately, the president of Brazil, Bolsonaro, refused to accept any help from neighboring countries or even the US in terms of putting out those fires. And that may have been based on economic aspects of what they want to do with their land after it's cleared. But that's a whole different topic. So we also have bigger tornado outbreaks. Here's the number, and the largest outbreaks is increasing from 1950 to 2017. And this is the average line here, the white line. And it's variable, but it's going up and up, and it's getting more extreme as we move towards the present. Other kinds of impacts. Also, obviously, we're having hurricanes. We're not necessarily experiencing a greater number of hurricanes, but the hurricanes that we are experiencing tend to be more fierce and causing more damage. So we're getting Cat 5 hurricanes, Cat 5, Cat 5, Cat 5. Here's Jose was a Cat 4, but Maria was Cat 5, Irma was a Cat 5, and the latest one showed us that many of these hurricanes are stalling. They're not moving very fast. And if they stay in one place, some of them are moving at like 1 mile an hour. And that's causing huge amounts of damage. If the winds are 180 to 200 miles an hour, the people and buildings can't sustain that for very long. So they're causing more damage. It's just that they're not being more frequent. So let's look at sort of a gestalt view of this. This is a map of the United States in 2018, the billion-dollar weather and climate disasters. So in the West, you have fires. Sort of in the middle of the country, you have hailstones. And you have tornadoes in the South. We have hurricanes there. We have flooding in the East. So all of these events were greater than $1 billion. That's for 2018. Let's look at 2019, the same sort of thing. We had, again, billion-dollar disasters, fires in the West, hailstones, flooding in the middle, tornadoes, lightning strikes, and then again, hurricanes. All of these billion-dollar disasters. So these are things that cost money and also human lives. So we have to start slowing this process down. And I think this is a good time for a little climate candor here. Only in America do we accept weather predictions from a rodent, but deny climate change evidence from scientists. Sometimes that's the way it feels, unfortunately. So next, let's talk a little bit about some of the other consequences of climate change. That would be sea level rise. So here we've got a 2,500-year record. And looking back, this is the height of the sea or anomalous areas. And this is the oceans, the black line is the mean of the ocean level going up and down. And we've got up until, again, we have the Industrial Revolution right here. And then right after the Industrial Revolution started with burning coal, oil, and gas, we start seeing that climbing up, not just to this level, but higher and higher and higher, exponentially higher, until we get some of the extreme events that we're experiencing now. Global mean sea level has risen about 7 to 8 inches since 1900. And it also has risen about 3 inches since 1993, which is much quicker. So how is this sea level rise caused? Well, about 50% of sea level rise is caused from the melting of glaciers and ice caps. And we'll take a look a little bit of that in a minute. About another 50% is caused from seawater expansion. Now, it's hard to believe that seawater would expand that much to really cause the entire globe to have higher sea levels, but it is true. That's what's happening. There's other factors involved, subsidence and plate movements, but these are the two main factors. So another 50% is, no, that's not right. Let me just continue on here. So with sea level rise comes threats to island nations. So here's a picture of the South Pacific area with many different populations here. I'll start with the Carteret Islands. Carteret Islands have about 2,000 residents, and they are already being affected by global sea level rise and destroying many of their villages. So they have made arrangements to move their populations over to the mainland of Papua New Guinea. Tuvalu is another population out there of about 10,000 people, and they have made arrangements to move their citizens to the South Island of New Zealand. The Kiribati or Kiribati Islands have more. They have 110,000 individual residents, which are now being dramatically affected by sea level rise. And they have negotiated with Fiji to go to some of their higher islands. This is happening all across the Pacific. These are only specific examples that I'm giving you. Even people on the shorelines are being affected. So up here is Shishmaref, Alaska, on the coast, and it includes Inupiaq Eskimo villages. And because the sea level, because the sea ice is melting, that normally protects them from ocean storms. Now those waves that are coming in from the storms are destroying their villages, and they are having to move inland to keep their villages safe. So let's look now at what's happening with geopolitical refugee migration. By 2050, we're expecting up to 140 million people to be migration refugees. That's just enormous. That's occurring in sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and Latin America. Let's take a look at a couple of examples that we know probably pretty well. Here's the lower boot of Florida. Florida has about 21 million residents. So keep your eye on this area of Florida. So 1, 2, 3, this is what's going to happen by 2050. And we may not see that end of Florida, which includes Miami area. So that's pretty dramatic. This is Shanghai. This is about the entire area of Shanghai, which has 26 million people. So watch this carefully. 1, 2, 3, Shanghai in 2050. It practically won't be there at all. So think about all those millions of people trying to find food and shelter, moving and migrating and to other countries. This is the stuff of wars, and we are going to be experiencing this really soon, relatively speaking. So for both COVID and climate change, we need to use science-based approaches. We need to do research, collect data early. We need to develop models and predictions and projections of what's going to happen in the future so we can use the best tools we have to solve those problems. We need to test all the time. Right now, unfortunately, the US has only tested less than 1% of our COVID cases, or our COVID individuals, to see if they have COVID. We also need to use all the tools in our toolbox, both for COVID as well as for climate change. And we all need to work together towards a common goal, both in terms of the United States nationally, and these are both global problems that we need to deal with on a global basis. We need to develop those solutions, and they're coming, but we just haven't gotten there yet on either one of them. And really, we're all in the same boat, we're all in the same canoe. So let's keep our nose to the grindstone and make sure that we incorporate science into both of these problems. So you've seen this graph before. This is the COVID graph that we don't want to peak too high. We need to bend that curve down. We need to stop the spread and get it down to a reasonable level where we can control it. So look at this graph, and then here's the other graph for COVID. This is the one from April 10th, where we had about 2,000 deaths per day in the United States. And here's the variance, or the variability of what the models are projecting as to how much we have in terms of deaths per day by April 12th. Now, by the time you see this, it's going to be April 22nd on Earth Day. This is where they expect the COVID deaths per day to be at. So we'll see what happens during that time. So here's this curve that we need to bend down. Look at the shape of that curve, and look at the shape of this curve. This is the curve for carbon dioxide emissions. So this is carbon dioxide emissions up here, 40 billion tons a year. And here, each one of these lines is a mathematical model output that tells us how we need to bring that curve down, stop the spread of carbon dioxide. So this black line from 1980 to 2010, or 2100, I'm sorry. This curve is increasing emissions up to where we are now in 2020. But if we started right here at the year 2000 to start reducing our emission output, that would be one of these lines here, and it would bring us down to a reasonable level where we need to be to fight climate change. We would have only needed to reduce our emissions by about 2% per year. However, we didn't do that. And of course, the emissions continue to rise continually up to where we are now at 2020. So what are we going to do? What happens if we do nothing? If we do nothing, this is what's going to happen. It's going to rise exponentially and keep going. So trust me, this is not a place that I would want to live in. And I suspect it's probably not one you would want to live in either. We need to stem this carbon dioxide output and bring it down to reality. So let's take a look back where we were before. So here's where we are now again. And if we start now, we could bend that curve down, but we would have to do that at a rate of about 5% per year instead of 2% per year. We're further along the curve here. So if we start now, we can hope to bring it down by 5%, but we're already into 2020, and that's not likely that we're going to bend this curve that fast. Now, each one of these dots is another year, so there's 10 dots there. That brings us to 2030. So if we just keep the concentration of carbon, or the emissions of carbon dioxide, at the same level for the next 10 years, that would mean that we would have to reduce carbon emissions by 9% per year, which is a phenomenally challenging process. So we have to figure out, excuse me, within the next 10 years, what we're going to do to bring that curve down, and to bring it down to where we aren't going to be experiencing these extreme events all the time, affecting both property and lives. All right, so part 2 of this series is the science of solutions to climate change. And I encourage you to look at part 2, because it will tell you how we're going to deal, or how we are already dealing in many cases with the climate change process. So one more, we need a vaccine for COVID-19. And we are believing that we are about 12 to 18 months away. We're hoping that that's the case. So we're going to inject COVID-19 vaccine here, take care of that little bugger. We also need a vaccine or something similar to that for climate change. And I think we may have something called carbon pricing, which may act much like a vaccine. If we inject that into the economy, we would have an increase in the price of fossil fuels, and which would favor the use of alternative energy sources. And Dana is going to talk a lot more about this in the third presentation. We still have some time for both, but not much. We need to fix both of these disasters and global issues as soon as possible because we don't have much time. So here's a global map of some of the countries that are putting a price on carbon in the green. So some of them are states, some of them are cities, and some of them are countries. So the green areas are ones where we already have some form of carbon pricing in place. But the rest of them are not doing that. And part 3 is going to be given by Dana to talk about the legislative and market-based solutions to climate change. So let's make sure that we take a look at that, and you'll learn a lot by watching Dana's presentation. So I'm going to end with this, a little more trouble here. Here's the COVID peak and bringing that curve down, but behind it, looming behind it, is a much bigger problem, global problem that we can't ignore. It's going to get bigger and bigger. So I'll be happy when this is over. So with that, thank you very much. That's the end of my presentation, and I encourage you to look now at parts 2 and parts 3. Thank you.
Welcome to part 2 of our 3-part presentation, COVID-19 and climate change, two sides of the same coin. My name is David Whitehead, and I'm representing the Nevada County chapter of the Citizens Climate Education and Citizens Climate Lobby. And we're joined today by the Sacramento chapter as our 2 chapters co-sponsor our first event together. Thank you all for being here. CCL seeks to build political will for solutions to climate change. We advocate for significant reductions in carbon emissions, and we work for solutions directed at those most at risk in our society from climate impacts. Our nonpartisan activism includes both education for our communities, as well as a presence in our local congressional district offices and on Capitol Hill. We host educational events like this one so that informed people will build political will, thereby increasing the chances that our country will take serious action on climate. We support current legislation, HR 763, the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act, which currently has 81 sponsors in the House of Representatives. Dr. Tom Suchanek will now present part 2, Scientific and Technological Solutions to Climate Change. Take it away, Tom.
Okay, this is part 2 of our 3-part series, Scientific and Technical Solutions to Climate Change. I encourage you to look back on the first part, which is COVID-19 and climate change, two sides of the same coin. And there will be a part 3, which I'll introduce to you in a little bit. So we're going to look at some of those issues, but start with some of these politicians discussing global warming. They're certainly not doing a very good job of stopping sea level rise, I can tell you that. But luckily, there is some hope. We have some good news. Nearly 1,500 governments worldwide have now declared climate emergencies, which sets them up to really deal with the problems and enact resolutions and legislation to force us to lower our emissions of carbon dioxide. Also, over 6,000 companies in 7,000 cities in 133 countries are implementing greenhouse gas emissions reduction actions and following the Paris Agreement protocols, which not every country is doing, unfortunately. So let's take a look at some of those solutions. How can we fix this climate change problem? In the last presentation, we've been talking about climate change, we've been talking about COVID a lot, and here's some of those pandemic heroes that we really should be thanking. Healthcare workers, policemen, grocers, first responders, doctors, nurses, and these government officials and people who are really setting the stage of how we deal with this. Dr. Fauci, Dr. Birx, Andrew Cuomo, and all of these agencies that are really working together very nicely to bring down the COVID curve and help us solve this problem. So thanks go out to all those pandemic heroes. We also have heroes from the climate change realm, and we have scientists that have started in the 1800s that knew things about about CO2 as a heat trapping gas for a really long time. So 5 out of these 6 people were actually published in this 2014 US National Climate Assessment report. Unfortunately, this lady here, Eunice Foote, was not. It was all a man's game at that point, at least in the report it was. However, Eunice was the first person to link CO2 to global warming in 1856. So I had to recognize her as a woman scientist and push these guys aside to stick her in there. So just recognize that we have known about this heat trapping gas for a long time, and that set us up to do many more things. Here's another one of our heroes. In 1988, James Hansen, who was the director of space studies at NASA, testified before Congress on how fast the Earth was warming, starting in 1880 to 1980, basically, going up and up, and had a model that he predicted what the future temperature of the Earth would be because of these greenhouse gases. So just keep in mind, James Hansen, we're going to see him a little bit later as well. So also, we have thousands and thousands of scientists who have worked over decades and decades doing research and writing scientific peer-reviewed papers, many of them associated with the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC. They've been producing these reports, assessment reports, since 1990, about every 5 to 7 years. We expected one in 2018, but there's a lot going on, and that's been postponed till 2021 or 22. So these guys and gals working in the arena of climate change, helping us to understand what we have done and what we need to do, are producing these kinds of reports here. I just gave 3 examples. Also working with the US Global Change Research Program, which I was involved in for several years as well. So they're producing a lot of information. We're doing this science-based, data-based, and it's important that we continue in that direction. So we have global solutions for climate change, and we're going to talk more about them. We have solar, we have wind, we have geothermal, we have hydro. All those can produce energy for us. We have some up-and-coming technologies like tidal ocean thermal energy conversion, which takes the difference in temperature between the top of the ocean and the bottom of the ocean. We have currents producing electricity, waves. All these are in prototype form right now. We have hydrogen fuel cells, which maybe are good for large operations, and they've tried some in cars, but we aren't quite there yet for cars. So let's move on to talk about some of these in detail. I have to put this on here. Every 2 minutes, the energy reaching the Earth from the sun is equivalent to the whole annual energy usage by humanity. That's just incredible. We have such a source of electricity and source of energy coming from the sun. We can't ignore it. And we need to use it. We are using it. And it's getting better and better in terms of pricing. But we need to focus more on capturing solar as much as we can. And we'll see a couple different options for solars in a little bit. So let's go solar as much as possible. So as California passed in 2018, as of January 1st this year, 2020, every new construction home, residential facility, has to have solar. And that will add about $9,500 to the cost of the construction. It will also save about $20,000 over the life of the home as well. So this is now law in California. We're way ahead of the curve on this. So just like the solar photovoltaic cells in the residential facilities, we also have this grid scale photovoltaics occupying massive areas, especially in the Mojave Desert and those areas in Southern California. These particular ones here are called trackers, and they move about 15 to 30 degrees to follow the sun, get the maximum incident radiation that they can for the maximum energy output. So let's look, so this is photovoltaics. Let's look at the pricing. Pricing has gone down. This is 2014, all the way down to 2018. And the price has been dropping every year, steadily, and it's still dropping now. So we're really getting mass production and also maximum utilization of photovoltaic cells. Now here's a different kind of solar. called heliostats, or solar power towers. And each one of these little white dots is another mirror, and these mirrors all point and collect energy and reflect sunlight up to the top of that tower, believe it or not, thousands of them. And basically they're heating up a liquid sodium, molten salts, which have high heat capacity, and that is able to be stored overnight when the sun is not shining. So we can use that both during the day and then at night when they extract the heat out of the molten salts to drive the turbines and produce energy from that. So tremendous operations. Again, many of these are down in the Mojave Desert in California. So let's take a look at that. Here's the Mojave. So the sort of gold colored bubbles here are photovoltaic farms. And the red bubbles are the solar power towers, the heliostats. So we've got a lot of them out there. There's some concern about environmental impacts to tortoises and things like that, but we're doing the best we can. That's a trade-off no matter what you do. So we have these options of different kinds of solar. And in March 5th of 2018, the utility grade solar, all these guys down here, met 50% of California's total electrical power demand for the very first time. That's just fantastic. Again, California is out there. Now, this isn't happening necessarily right now, but because March is not a very energy intensive needs month, but we're raising our contributions from solar all the time. So wind. Wind is probably the second best option that we have in terms of renewables. Provides 4.3% of the world's energy supplies, and which is up from 1% in 2006. So it's growing tremendously. Just came back from Germany recently, and every German village has wind power in their village, supporting them. It's everywhere, all over the landscape. And so we need to up ourselves from wind. Germany is producing those wind turbines. We need to produce wind turbines as well. Germany is eating our lunch on those, just like China is eating our lunch on solar production, so photovoltaics. So this is San Gorgonio Pass in Palm Springs, giving you an example of what some of those wind farms look like. And probably you in California may be more familiar with Altamont Pass, which is going towards San Francisco, which has a 576 megawatt plant. And it's probably one of the oldest and largest wind turbine farm in the world. So Germany is on top on that. But in other areas besides California, we have these huge ocean-based wind farms. And this is right off the coast of London. So each one of these red dots represents another wind farm out there. And so let's take a closer look at some of those areas. So here's the North Sea again. Here's London, here's Belgium, and each one of those little propeller-shaped icons is another wind farm out there. The pink area represents an area that has already been approved or that they're under construction for more wind farms in these areas. And the orange locations are those that have submitted applications to build wind farms, but they haven't been approved yet. So they're flooding this area, they're filling this area with enormous amount of wind energy options, which is providing Europe a huge amount of fossil fuel free electricity. So once we've got the electricity, what are we going to do with it? We have to potentially store it someplace to be able to use it like a battery in our flashlights. So battery storage is up and coming. The first household battery storage product was Tesla's homemade Powerwall, home battery system. And this can support a home for, say, 1 to 7 days of continuous power when the grid system goes down, or if the grid system goes down. Similarly, here's one of those large photovoltaic solar plants fields. And as long as we collect that from there, we can also store it in a grid scale battery system. So again, Tesla was the first to develop one of these grid scale battery systems in South Australia, which is the first and the largest battery storage project in the world. And it's not just Tesla that's doing this. We have 7 other companies that are out there across the globe doing this, developing 400 megawatt hour grid scale battery systems, shown down here. So they're up and coming, they're dotting the globe, and we are gaining on this battery process very quickly. So let's talk about transportation. This guy is producing carbon dioxide, but not that much. California's emissions of carbon dioxide are basically 40% are due to transportation, because we drive so many cars here. Over the US, averaged over the US is producing about 30% of its emissions from transportation. And globally, it's only 14% of global emissions. So we have to do something about transportation, not this guy, but the one after him in the automobiles. So countries banning gas cars. All these countries here have already announced that they are banning gas cars by implementing them by these different dates, 2030, 2040, 2050. So we're making progress. We're making tremendous progress. In January of 18, California Bill AB 1745 was passed to ban all new vehicles fueled by internal combustion engines by 2040. I don't know if that actually passed. It may not have passed, and we're still resubmitting that now. But on November of last year, Governor Newsom deemed that we will have no more all gas cars for the California government. So yay for that. So if you want to help this process of electrifying our vehicles, you could buy your honey one of these things, one of those things right there. It's called a Tesla. And I'm waiting for my honey to build me one. Not build me one. She'd have a hard time doing that. Just buy me one. Don't use my money, use hers. So what can we do? If you don't want or can't afford to buy a Tesla, you could go to this website, what EV to buy, what electric vehicle do you want to buy, or go to my website. I have this on my website as well. And you can see every single manufacturer has some form of electric car, some form of electric energy for cars. So on this side, you will see how many miles you would get out of a charge. And this side, you would get to see the cost of those vehicles. So how many miles you get is inversely proportional to how much it's going to cost. So you have this little list of cars here is sort of inverted for the other side. So you can look for hybrids of all kinds. You can look for a battery electric vehicle. You can look for a plug-in hybrid electric vehicle. You can look for a fuel cell electric vehicle. But there's tons of options out here. And as we move into 2021 and 22, even more of those vehicles are going to be in the electric range. Both Dana and I drive electric vehicles. His is a pure electric, mine's a plug-in hybrid. So yay for us. And if you want to really look at what's happening in the alternative energy and renewable energy field, go to cleantechnica.com. It's a fantastic website. It's at the cutting edge of alternative energy news, and you can sign up for their news feed, and they will send you news clips, news feeds by email every week. Actually, it's every day now. So it's not so many things are happening. You'll be not on the cutting edge, you'll be on the bleeding edge of what's happening in terms of alternative energy news. So go there and check it out. So not only are automobiles getting electrified, but so are semi-trucks. And Tesla came out with the first semi-truck as well. He's really knocking them off here. And you know that Elon Musk loves speed. So you can imagine this semi here goes 0 to 60 in 5 seconds. Now that's with the cab. With the trailer attached, it's 0 to 60 in 20 seconds. Yeah, much longer period of time. Anyway, it's all electric. And there are many other companies actually that are doing this as well. Daimler, Cummins, Nikola, Thor. Nikola's making cars as well. And this is great for semis because they're often involved with truck farms, which go from point A to point B, dropping off their material, and then picking up new material, go back from point B to point A, back and forth, recharge at both ends. Perfect. No use of fossil fuels. So many of these are also planning to go autonomous, no driver vehicles. This N-Ride down here is one that is presumed to go autonomous almost right away. This is just a prototype, but I'm not sure what I would do if I saw one of those things coming at me down the road, especially without a driver. That's going to be hard to take. I think I'd just go off on the next exit. So not only semis, but the military has been on this for decades. They've been developing hybrid electric drive vehicles for a long time, even hybrid electric drive tanks and people movers and jeeps and fuel trucks. All of these things are electrified in one way or another. And they're building, there is being built a new tank that's all electric. So you can sneak up on your enemy and nobody will hear you coming. So they're doing a lot in this area. And similarly with ferries, ferries have the same issue. They go from point A to point B to point A, back and forth, and they can utilize this technology and recharging at each end. So New York has these types of ferries in Long Island Sound, Staten Island, Ellis Island, Liberty Island, Washington State ferries, similarly in Puget Sound and Kitsap Peninsula. And the Alcatraz Hornblower ferry system has been using this for a long time. They have photovoltaic cells on the roof of the Alcatraz prison, also on the roof of each one of their ferries. And in addition, they have wind power that's creating electricity for them as well. So they are really on it. Since 2009, the entire Alcatraz fleet has been converted to some form of hybrid power. Fantastic. So the ultimate, electric planes. So that would be the last big challenge. However, Harbour Air, this company called Harbour Air in Vancouver, British Columbia, just a couple months ago, became the first commercial airline to be electric. And here's an example of one of them. This is called an Otter or a Beaver. And they used 350 to 500 to 750 horsepower electric engines. And typically this is a startup here, but they go 30 to 60 miles transporting fishermen or hunters out into the backcountry. So this is an example of what's coming. There's 7 more companies on the horizon that are doing this. So we're gaining on them fast. And Airbus has a competition now to really see who can build the best, lightest, most efficient electric airplane. And in 20 years, we're likely to have commercial airplanes that carry over 100 passengers. Imagine that. Just incredible. So let's keep our eyes open for those. Okay, in addition to being able to reduce our carbon emissions of CO2 to the atmosphere, in order to solve this problem, we really need to be taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere as well. The reason for that is that carbon dioxide, once it's put into the atmosphere, will remain there for 500 to 1,000 years. And we don't have that amount of time to wait to solve this problem. So we need to start taking that carbon dioxide that's already in the air, out of the atmosphere. So here's our best carbon dioxide taker-outer that was ever built. And trees are important, which is why we need to preserve our forests. We need to reforest. And planting a tree in your own backyard helps. Everything helps. So let's take a look at what's happening with artificial trees. This is what's called direct air capture. And this is removing the atmosphere, removing the CO2 from the atmosphere that's already there. So CO2 represents only 1 in 2,500 molecules in the air. And that's 300 times less than what's even being produced from smokestacks. But we need to reverse that process, sort of like pulling that carbon dioxide right back into the smokestacks. It's not really what's happening, but this is a global company. This is a company called Global Thermostat. And this company is one of quite a number of them that's actually doing this in prototype right now. So here's direct air capture one, first company that I'll show you. This is working with solids, these amines that pull carbon dioxide out of the air to produce a product called carbamate, which then you can do many different things with. So the first time we were able to pull carbon dioxide out of the air was developed by the Nazi scientists who used liquid sorbents to remove accumulations of CO2 in submarines. Now we're doing this to pull it out of our atmosphere. Here's one in Menlo Park by Global Thermostat. Here's another one of their plants in Huntsville, Alabama. And there are, 7 companies working on this, both in the US and also around the globe, direct air capture facilities. They're still in prototype form, but they're making progress, and I'm sure that we have to be able to do this in order to bring our carbon dioxide down. So 50 years ago, we had the Apollo 11 moonshot, one small step for man, and 1969. So I have always been inspired by JFK's announcement of this. Said, we choose to go to the moon. We choose to do this not because it's easy, but because it's hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we are willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one which we intend to win. This is so relevant now in terms of climate as well as COVID. We need to do that. We need to take the challenge and work as hard as we possibly can to solve these problems. And the tools to put a man on the moon didn't exist at that time. It took NASA 8 years and 400,000 people to literally invent the rocket, the spaceship that could land on the moon, the spacesuits, and all of that had to be invented from scratch. And here's a little fun fact. An iPhone today has more processing power than every NASA computer in existence in the early 1960s. So we have the technology today to do this. I've been showing you some of these things, but not all of them. So trust that we have that. We just need to implement that technology. So here's the graph I showed in the previous talk. And this is carbon dioxide going up, 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 passing the year 2000, where we still haven't slowed the increase of carbon dioxide. Each one of these, again, is a model run of where we could bend the curve, like we're bending the curve for COVID. If we started in the year 2000, here's James Hansen. We didn't start then, but if we continue on, and we have continued on to 2000, we still haven't slowed it down. If we continue on up to the place we are now, if we start now, again, we would have to remove carbon dioxide from the emissions rate at about 5% per year. If we continue on the rate that we're at for the next 10 years to 2030, we would have to start reducing our emissions by 9% per year. That would be a tremendous challenge. So you can look back on the earlier talk, but this is the essence of what we need to do. We need to flatten this curve, just like we need to flatten the curve for climate change and COVID, both the same way. We need to get in there and do it, whatever it takes. So let's deal with some of the unfortunate politics. Here's our friend James Hansen again, 1988. Just coincidentally, George H.W. Bush was also in his presidential campaign in 1988. And this was his slogan: we'll fix the global warming effect with the White House effect. And he did win that campaign and served from 1989 to 1993. He did do some good things for the environment, but unfortunately he didn't do this one. He was an oil man, he owned his own oil company, and we never did fix that at that time. And now that brings us to 2015, which was the Paris Accord, the Paris Climate Accord, or the Paris Climate Agreement, which at that time, 2015, the Obama administration pulled together 194 countries, actually it was 196 countries, to agree to start implementing processes to reduce our emissions on the globe. Unfortunately, this Paris Agreement or Paris Accord got ratified in 2016, and unfortunately, the Trump administration in the very next year, 2017, started pulling us out of the Paris Accord. And as of November 4th of last year, we began to formally pull out of the Paris Agreement. And November 4th of this year, 2020, we will be out of the Paris Accord completely. So I think we need a new world leader to help solve this climate crisis. None of the other world leaders are stepping up to do this. And in fact, many of them have been lax in doing the actual agreements that they did in the Paris Accord. So we need someone to pull everyone together again, and let's hope we can do that. So another thing that can help in terms of slowing the output of carbon dioxide is the global fossil fuel industry subsidies. These are being given to 191 countries, 85% of those subsidies are for coal and oil. And it's hard to conceive of, but 2017, this was $5.2 trillion of subsidies going to the fossil fuel companies. They're making a lot of money, and I'm not sure why they need $5.2 trillion in subsidies. That's 6.5% of global gross domestic product. So who's doing this? Well, China is supplying some of those subsidies, like $1.4 trillion. And the US is the second largest subsidy giver at $649 billion. If we just took some of this out, why are we doing this? If we took like 2% away from the subsidies that are being granted, that's $104 billion. We could do a lot with $104 billion towards improving our ability to implement reductions of CO2 and renewable energy supplies. So let's think about that. Another thing that's happening is in the realm of divestments and investments. As of January of this year, BlackRock, which is the largest asset manager in the world, has $6.9 trillion in assets and the world's biggest owner of fossil fuel companies. BlackRock is now, as of January, putting climate change and sustainability at the core of their investment strategy. Amazing. They're also divesting investments away from coal, and they're ramping up pressure on polluters. Not only BlackRock, but the biggest public bank in the world, European Investment Bank, is stopping lending to fossil fuel projects. They're allocating 8 billion euros to reduce carbon pollution and committing 1 trillion euros over the next decade to combat climate change. It's amazing. The marketplace is working even without enormous outcry. And there's a lot of outcry, but they're looking at the future, I think, because they know that alternative energy is coming to help our climate. How can you and us and all of us reduce our carbon footprint? There's lots of things that we do that help to create this carbon dioxide glut that we have. And I've got about 50 things on my website that can help you understand all the little things that you can do that helps. Every little thing does help. So this is on my website. It's tomsuchanek.net. And also on my website is Dana and I have some archived presentations. We taught an 11-week climate change course, which is on there. And November 15th lecture we also did on global climate change crisis, the urgency and race for solutions. And today's presentation will be on there as well. So what are the most critical actions that we can take? We need to educate ourselves and our tribe, those peeps that you hang around with. We need to communicate with our mocks. That's not moccasins, that's members of Congress. So what can we do? I've talked to many legislators and their staff, and they say to me every time that every single piece of information, whether it's a tweet, a postcard, a letter, an email, anything that they receive on somebody's information of their opinion on something, they assume that that represents somewhere between 100 and 1,000 other individuals who would never think of communicating with their members of Congress. So write those letters, join a group, send those tweets, just get involved. You can do that with any of the CCL groups as well. So one of the most important things is, of course, vote. Vote in all local, state, and national elections for those individuals who will work hard to solve this global crisis. So here's a map that shows where those areas are on the Earth that are putting a price on carbon, which is going to help a lot. The big areas are countries, the bigger circles are states, smaller circles are cities. So we know that there's a lot going on out there. But Dana is going to talk in part 3 about the legislative and market-based solutions to climate change. And I encourage you all to watch his presentation right after this one. So there we have it. Vote every time, all the time. Thank you very much.
Our next presenter is Mr. Dana Nuccitelli. Dana is an environmental scientist and climate journalist with a bachelor's degree in astrophysics from UC Berkeley and a master's degree in physics from UC Davis. Dana has written for skepticalscience.com since 2010 and for The Guardian since 2013. For Yale Climate Connections since 2018. He also published the book Climatology versus Pseudoscience in 2015. So Dana, take it away.
All right, thanks, David. So this is our coronavirus curve, and we've all heard that we need to flatten the curve, which basically means we need to implement measures and policies to reduce the spread of the outbreak so that it doesn't overwhelm our healthcare system. So with climate change, we have a very similar curve. This is our carbon emissions from fossil fuels, basically since the Industrial Revolution. And you can see it's got that same exponential growth going up and up and up. We have made some progress in recent years to slow that down, but it's still going in the wrong direction at the moment. So we had the Paris Climate Agreement that virtually every country agreed to, with the goal of keeping global temperatures less than 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels in the future. And so if we're going to meet that curve, meet that goal, then the curve has to look something like this. Basically needs to peak very fast and then bend and go in the other direction very fast. So that's sort of our equivalent. We need to implement policies to make the curve not just flatten, but bend very dramatically in the opposite direction. So how do we do that? We need to implement policies because individual action is good, but it can only do so much. So for example, if we have individual shelter in place, but most people don't shelter in place, then that's not going to stop the spread of coronavirus. Likewise, if we have some individuals reducing their carbon emissions, but lots of other people don't, that's not going to be enough to bend this curve either. So we need to have basically government policies that create the incentive for people to change their behavior, as with shelter in place with coronavirus or with carbon emissions of climate change. So there are various categories of policy approaches to do that. One, it's called command and control, but it's basically government regulation, which that was our equivalent with coronavirus of sheltering in place, telling people that they have to stay at home as much as possible. So there are a lot of different categories of this with climate change. There are the vehicle fuel efficiency standards, the CAFE standards, which are currently a fight between the Trump administration, which wants to freeze them in place, and California and some other states, which want to keep making vehicles more fuel efficient. So this is basically the government telling car companies that they have to keep making their average fleet fuel efficiency increase over time. With the Obama administration, their EPA put forth the Clean Power Plan, which was basically a way to regulate power plants, telling them they can only emit a certain amount of greenhouse gases. That likewise has been undone by the Trump administration. Another good example is the Green New Deal, which I'm going to talk about more in a bit, which is basically a bunch of different, mostly regulation-based ways to reduce emissions. Then we have market-based approaches. And so the idea there is that you use the markets to change behaviors, because since we're in a capitalism, if something is free, people are going to take advantage of it. And so currently carbon pollution is free. And so there's a lot of carbon pollution going on. So you have to put a fee on that carbon pollution to change that behavior. So a couple ways to do that. One is with a cap and trade system. So this was originally championed by the George H.W. Bush administration when they had a problem of acid rain that they were trying to solve. They didn't want to just do it with regulations, because conservatives tend to not like regulations. So they created this concept of cap and trade system to solve that, and it worked really well. I'll talk about that more in a bit. In California, we have a carbon cap and trade system. It was passed through Assembly Bill 32, AB 32, and that's been working pretty well too. And then the other approach you can do is just put a fee or a tax on the pollution. So Tom showed a lot of examples of carbon taxes around the world. One really good one is that Canada passed a nationwide carbon tax about 1.5 years ago. Okay, so I want to talk about the Green New Deal, because that's kind of been the big thing that's gotten a lot of attention recently, and there's not a lot of good understanding of what it is. So right now, it's basically, there was a resolution passed in the House that kind of outlines, it gives the framework of what a Green New Deal would entail. The goal is to get the American economy to carbon neutrality, zero emissions as soon as possible. And it proposes to do that with this 10-year mobilization to tackle all these different aspects of our infrastructure and our economy. So for example, trying to transition all electricity to zero carbon sources, make buildings more energy efficient, tackle greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture, get more electric cars, better public transportation, pull carbon out of the atmosphere with trees and technologies like Tom talked about, and invest in some green technology research and development. So there's a lot of different things they're trying to tackle within the Green New Deal. Unfortunately, there's also a lot of misinformation about the Green New Deal. So I'm going to play a little clip here with a member of Congress giving an example of such misinformation.
Since they still, in this Green New Deal, want to control my life, let me go to President Obama's favorite place and realize that if this goes through, this will be outlawed. I can no longer eat this type of thing. So before they take it away from me, pass it around.
I don't think it's progressive to tell me I can't have cars and airplanes. That sounds like medieval.
I don't think that's not what's being said here, Tucker.
Okay.
That you can't have cars and airplanes.
So yeah, there are a lot of these myths associated with the Green New Deal, so I'm going to really quickly go through a few of them. We just heard the one from Tucker Carlson that's going to ban airplanes and cars and stuff, and that's just not the case. We heard from the member of Congress they're going to ban hamburgers, or we hear they're going to ban farting cows. Just also not the case, and just to set the record straight, the methane emissions we worry about from cows are from their burps and their poops, not from their farts. So it'd be nice to get that correct. It doesn't say anything about nuclear energy. And there was a conservative think tank that made a bunch of silly assumptions and came up with an estimate that it will cost $93 trillion, which is just not accurate. So the strength arguments in favor of the Green New Deal the main one is that it grasps the scale of the climate crisis we're facing. So if we're going to bend that curve, we saw how dramatically our carbon emissions have to reduce, how fast and how much they have to reduce to kind of bend the curve in the opposite direction. And to do that, we have to address all these different sectors that have significant carbon emissions: electricity, transportation, buildings, industry. And so the Green New Deal does that with this 10-year mobilization, targeting all of these different sectors. So it kind of grasps with the problem that we're looking at. The main argument against it, people will say it's unrealistic. Senator Dianne Feinstein, a Democrat from California, was asked if she would support the Green New Deal, and she said no, because it's not paid for and it won't pass Congress. So I don't find those arguments compelling personally. So saying that it won't pass Congress, I mean, let's be honest, right now there's virtually nothing that will pass Congress, and certainly no significant climate policy that will pass Congress. So if you don't support anything that won't pass, then you won't support any significant climate policy at all. And saying it's not paid for. So for one thing, we do a lot of things in Congress that aren't paid for. We just passed this $2.2 trillion coronavirus stimulus that wasn't paid for. A year or two ago, we did $1 trillion tax break that wasn't paid for. The Iraq and Afghanistan wars have cost $5 trillion that aren't paid for. So we decide if there's something that we think is important enough to do, we don't have to figure out how to pay for it immediately. And then another important point is that climate change solutions often do pay for themselves because, for one thing, they're more efficient and more cost effective over the long term, over their lifetimes, than fossil fuel technologies. And they also tend to create cleaner air and cleaner water, which creates better public health, which has economic benefits, and they slow climate change. Tom talked about all these billion-dollar climate disasters that we've been seeing, from hurricanes, fires, droughts. These things cost a lot of money. So if you're slowing climate change, then you're reducing these future climate costs from these large disasters. So you have to take that into account, that it's an upfront investment that's going to have these long-term returns. Okay, so let's talk about those market-based solutions that I mentioned. So first one, cap and trade. That's been popular for a long time. So the idea is that the government will set a cap on the total number of pollution that is allowed, and they will sell those in an auction in terms of permits. And then industry will go into the auction and they will buy as many permits as they think they need to cover their pollution. So the strength of cap and trade is that that cap gives the government control over exactly how much pollution is allowed. So if the industry goes above that level of pollution, then they have to pay a fine. And so it's better for them just to buy the permits. So the government can then set that level. They can reduce the cap over time. So you make sure you're reducing the pollution over time. And then there's also the flexibility for the companies participating in the cap and trade system to trade the permits back and forth. So if one company didn't buy enough permits, they can buy or trade permits with another company that bought too many. And so it gets more flexibility. So it's economically beneficial because of that flexibility. The downside of cap and trade is that it can be very complicated, especially, for example, if they allow offsets. Which is when a company can go outside of the cap and trade system and buy an offset somewhere else. So for example, let's say PG&E is participating in the California cap and trade system and they didn't have enough permits. So they buy some trees in the Brazilian rainforest and say, we're going to protect these trees in the Brazilian rainforest. So that's great. The trees sequester carbon. So that represents a reduction in carbon emissions. That makes sense. The problem is, it's really hard to monitor these things over time. So if like a year later, somebody cuts down those trees that PG&E had paid to protect and nobody's monitoring it, nobody realizes that the carbon emission savings are gone, but PG&E is taking credit for it. And so that's a real problem with these offsets. Like worldwide, a lot of them are kind of vaporware. They don't represent actual emissions reductions. Another one is carryover permits, which is basically when a company, when the carbon price at auction is low, they buy a whole bunch of them and bank them and kind of set them aside. And then as in future years, as the auction price for pollution permits goes up, they then say, we're going to use, instead of buying these expensive permits and reducing our emissions, we're going to use these cheaper permits that we bought in the past. And so since they're using these cheaper permits, they're not actually reducing their emissions in the future. And so basically these are ways for companies to kind of game the system with cap and trade. So that's the downside, is that can be gamed because it's such a complicated system. So then there's the carbon tax, which, as the name suggests, you put a fee or tax on the carbon pollution. So the benefit there is that it's really simple. There's no trading, there's no offsets. It's just, there's no way to game the system. The amount of carbon in the fossil fuel gets taxed, and that's it. It's very straightforward. The downside is that it doesn't have that cap that a cap and trade system has, and so the government doesn't have as much control over the total level of pollution. So it becomes tricky. You have to set the carbon fee at the right level so that it's high enough to kind of change people's behavior, to dissuade them from creating the pollution, from buying the fossil fuels, but not too high that they can't afford it and it creates economic problems. So that's the challenge with a carbon tax. And then with either of these market-based systems, they're going to generate revenue either by selling the carbon pollution permits in the cap and trade system or with the carbon tax. And so the government collects that revenue. Then there's always a debate, what do you do with that revenue? There's always fights in government. There's some revenue that can be spent. So one way to address that, it's called revenue neutrality, which is when you take all that revenue and you just send it back to taxpayers. And I'm going to talk about that some more as well. So that's what our bill does. This is the Citizens Climate Lobby bill that Tom mentioned. It's called the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act, House Resolution HR 763. So as Tom mentioned, it's got 81 co-sponsors in the House of Representatives. It puts a fee on fossil fuels based on the amount of carbon in that fossil fuel. So we know, for example, how much carbon is in a barrel of oil or a ton of coal or a quantity of natural gas. So you just put the fee on the fossil fuel based on that carbon content. With this legislation, the carbon pollution price starts low. So it starts at $15 per ton of carbon dioxide, which if you want to put it in terms of, like, for example, a gallon of gas, it will raise the price of a gallon of gas by about 14 cents, 13 to 14 cents. So that's a relatively small increase. Gasoline prices already fluctuate more than that, so you won't notice that too much. So it kind of starts gently, but then it rises, the price rises steadily over time, $10 per ton per year, which is about 9 cents per gallon of gasoline per year. So you kind of see this price of gasoline going up, and you know it's going to keep going up in the future. And so that's going to incentivize people to change their behavior accordingly, drive less, buy a more fuel efficient car, maybe buy an electric car, for example. And then in this bill, all of the tax revenue is sent back to households equally per person with a monthly check. And I'm going to talk about why we do that. But one reason is that it makes it a small government solution, which makes it appealing to conservatives because the government isn't keeping the money and spending it, it's just sending it back to people. And then it's also progressive. I'm going to explain how it's progressive in a minute. So since it's both appeals to conservatives and progressives, and it has this bipartisan appeal. So how much will it cost? This is a nice chart that kind of shows for a $75 per ton carbon tax, which is where our bill, so say this bill were implemented in 2021, we would be at $75 per ton in 2027. So this is what it would look like in costs per year, per household, broken down by income bracket. So for the poorest 20% income brackets, it would, paying for these carbon taxes would increase the average household energy bills by $865 per year. For the richest 20%, it would increase their average household bills by $1,900 per year. And so one aspect you can see, this increases the wealthier the income bracket gets. The reason for that is very simple. The wealthier you are, the more stuff you buy, the more you travel, so the bigger your carbon footprint is. And so therefore, the more you're paying in terms of carbon taxes. So that makes sense, but there is a downside here. So the wealthiest 20% in America, they're making on average, a household is making $234,000 per year. So you increase their annual bill by $1,900. It's, it's something, but they can afford it. On the other hand, if you look at the poorest 20%, on average, they're making $14,000 per household per year. Suddenly you give them another $865 bill in increased energy prices. It's really hard for them to afford that because a bigger percentage of their income is going to buying energy, a bigger proportion. So we saw a real world example of this not too long ago. France, Macron passed a gas tax, which with the goal of addressing climate change. And as a result, we saw these yellow vest protests in the streets. And remember, this is in France. This is not like a bunch of climate deniers. France is generally very supportive of doing something to tackle climate change throughout the population. The problem was that these poorer households, they just couldn't afford the increased tax. And so you have to do something policy-wise so that you're not addressing climate change on the backs of these poorer households. And so the way we propose to do that is by making the carbon tax revenue neutral, sending the money back to households with an equally sized check per person. And if you do that, then you get a dividend check, something like that on an annual basis. So you can see it's the red line. It will be roughly what the check will look like for each household. And the line is above the increased energy bills for the poorer households. It's below the average bill for the richest households for their costs associated with energy use. So basically what that means is that for the poorer households, since they're getting a rebate check that's larger than their increased energy bills, they're getting a net income from this policy. And that's true for the majority of Americans and all of the, on average, the lower income households. When you get to the higher income households, because they have this larger carbon footprint, they have these larger fossil fuel costs, larger carbon costs, they are still going to have a net costs where their increased carbon prices or carbon taxes and increased energy bills are going to be larger than the dividend check, but it's still going to blunt the effect for them as well. This is why it is appealing to progressives, because this is your kind of your progressive money distribution. So you can see for the poorest 20% of households, they get roughly on average a $1,400 net income from this particular bill, from this legislation, which is actually very similar to what we're going to be getting from the coronavirus stimulus bill in terms of checks in the very near future. So then we can look at what it's going to do to fossil fuel emissions, to carbon emissions. Columbia and Rhodium did an analysis of our bill, HR 763, just recently. And so I'm going to show a couple of nice charts from that report. So this first one shows how it will change US greenhouse gas emissions. So the top light blue line is under current policy, how US emissions are expected to change. You can see they go down very little, but they're pretty flat because we don't have much in the way of a national climate policy right now. Whereas under the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act, that's the dark blue on the bottom, you can see a very rapid reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, 20% less than would be under the current policy. So it's very effective, this bill, at reducing emissions. So then we can look at how it relates to our commitments. So on this chart, the dark blue is our actual US greenhouse gas emissions to date. And then the light blue is our commitments under the Copenhagen International Climate Accord and the Paris International Climate Accord, which, although Tom mentioned we're in the process of pulling out of, we are still technically in the Paris Climate Agreement. So you can see we were on track with meeting our targets up until 2016, 2017. We all know what happened then. Since then, emissions have been pretty flat. We've started to kind of pull away from our commitments, going above where our commitments would have us be. And so if we put that previous chart onto this one, under current policy, we would kind of go further and further away from our commitments. Whereas if we were just to pass this Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act, it would get us back on track with our Copenhagen and our Paris climate targets. So just this one carbon tax bill is enough to at least get us moving in the right direction, back consistent with our international targets. So that's all I've got. I'm going to pass it back to David, and he's going to moderate our question and answer session.
Thank you, Dana. Well, between the two presentations, I think a message might be that we face two tremendous threats to our standard of living, COVID-19 and climate change. We've tried ignoring these problems, and now we've basically turned our entire world upside down to fight the COVID-19 pandemic, and we may need to do the same to fight climate change. We have a bunch of questions here, and I think I'll start off with the first question. Doesn't the Green New Deal cost billions or even trillions of dollars? Where are we going to find the money, and won't that destroy our economy?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, and I've got a couple slides related to that. So there's a group called Project Drawdown. In 2017, they actually published a New York Times best-selling book called Drawdown that basically they have energy experts and climate experts that analyze the kind of the top 100 most effective individual climate solutions, things like wind turbines and solar panels and things like that, and kind of put together a plan of how we can reduce our emissions. And then just recently they published this called the Drawdown Review of 2020, where they did an economic analysis of all these solutions. And so the bottom line here was that if we want to keep global warming to this Paris target of less than 2 degrees Celsius, there will be an additional global investment into all these different solutions and technologies of something in the ballpark of $25 trillion. So that's a lot of money. But they also found that because these technologies are more efficient, so for example, if you think of wind turbines and solar panels, they have very little operation and maintenance costs, and then their fuel cost is free. There's no cost for wind, there's no cost for the sunlight. And so over time, they actually save money as compared to fossil fuel, where you have to keep mining coal and drilling for oil and these things. And so same thing for light bulbs and all these different technologies, LED light bulbs. Over time, over their lifetime, they actually save money as compared to these kind of fossil fuel and older technologies. And so they estimated that if you make these investments, you actually end up saving a whole lot of money. So you return your investment many times over, something in the ballpark of $125 trillion if you follow their plan. And in addition to that, that's just from like the direct savings from operations and maintenance and lifetime costs. But you also phase out these fossil fuels that cause other pollutants, that cause air pollution, water pollution, have all these adverse health effects that have really serious costs, like major costs associated with people breathing in air pollution. And they slow climate change. And so they reduce the cost of these extreme hurricanes, extreme heat waves, extreme wildfires. And so that's additionally many trillions of dollars that you're saving by implementing these solutions. So the issue is that it is, if we have to be honest and say it is a big upfront investment cost, and we don't like making these big upfront investments, but over the long term, the returns are much bigger than the investments. And so that's a key thing to keep in mind.
Thank you. Another question is, what other countries have a carbon tax in place? And if only a few countries have a carbon tax, how will that work? And how is that fair? How will we solve a global problem with only a US policy?
A lot of countries already have carbon taxes in place. So a lot of countries are already addressing this problem. And then another way to do this is that in our bill, I didn't mention it has a border adjustment, which basically means that when we import something from another country, if that country doesn't have a carbon tax in place, then we basically implement the carbon tax and we keep the money. And so a country that's exporting to the United States, they don't want to give up that revenue. And so it gives them the incentive to implement the tax themselves so that they get to keep the carbon tax revenue. And so, yeah, if you do it in a smart way and do these kind of border adjustments, then you create the incentive for other countries to do kind of the same kind of policies.
Thank you. The next question I have from our group is, what is the cost to the U.S. per year to achieve CO2 reduction needed versus the cost of our current trajectory? In other words, what is the cost of action versus the cost of inaction?
Yeah, so I mean, it just depends on how you do it, because it's going to depend on exactly the policies that we implement. So I put out these costs. These are the global costs if you follow the project drawdown approach. But the national costs will be different. It depends, if you do it with a carbon tax or with, regulations, or if you do a Green New Deal. So, I mean, the various presidential candidates all had climate plans that were in the trillions of dollars for the United States costs. But again, these plans all yield these significant benefits in terms of more efficient technologies, less operation maintenance costs, and then, better health from reduced pollution and from reduced climate catastrophes. So, I mean, it's hard to put numbers on it because it depends on exactly what policies we implement and what path we follow. So basically the short answer is that kind of the more aggressively you implement these cheap technologies that are cheap in the long run, then that's going to be the least overall long-term cost, or the greatest overall long-term benefits. So the more aggressive you are, as with coronavirus, the more aggressive you are upfront, the better it is in the long term.
Thank you. Are you aware of any estimates of human mortality per year from climate change impacts? And could you compare that to the mortality of COVID-19?
It's really hard to estimate climate change mortalities because there are a lot of indirect ways that climate change causes deaths. So for example, climate change will put a lot of stress on agricultural systems by creating these droughts and heat waves and things that are bad for agriculture. And then if you're reducing agricultural output, then you're increasing food prices and increasing food scarcity, and therefore you're increasing food insecurity, and then that leads to deaths indirectly because people then can't afford enough food. It causes starvation, it causes conflicts. So I believe I've seen an estimate from the WHO that climate change causes something like 300,000 deaths per year. I think that's in the present or possibly the near future. So that is, currently larger than coronavirus deaths. Also, coronavirus is hopefully basically one-term event, whereas climate change is a long-term thing that's going to be, we're going to have impacts every single year. So in the long term, climate change is certainly the bigger, it's going to have more deaths associated with it than the coronavirus, but in the near term, it's hard to say. Coronavirus in the very near term is a more urgent, like abrupt threat, whereas climate change is a more long-term threat.
Thank you. There's a couple of questions about food production. What are the prospects for raising enough food in a chaotic climate? And how could food production be affected if we do nothing in the next 5 years?
Yeah, so the IPCC recently did a special report on land where they looked at how food insecurity is going to become a problem, kind of the closer or the further we get beyond those Paris climate targets. So basically, as you get more warming, you also get more, like I said, you get more these worse heat waves, these worse droughts, these things that put stresses on agriculture, and that creates problems with supplying enough food to everybody around the world. So yeah, the general rule is the more climate change and the more warming you have, the more stress it puts on those systems and the more problems you have with providing enough food for everybody.
Okay, Thanks. I think the last question is kind of maybe it's about hope. Seeing the response that we are seeing right now to COVID, what gives you, both of you, hope about responding to climate change?
Tom, you're good at hope.
Well, I'm on the edge here. I have hope myself. I'm optimistic that what I'm seeing in the recent couple of years, actually, the last year or 2 years, is that more of these extreme events have been happening. And the more extreme events have been happening, and people are recognizing the impacts of climate change to their own personal lives. It's slapping them in the face. Their relatives are dying, their homes are washing away, their fires are burning up their forests and their homes as well. So I think as the impacts get more and more extreme, people are being more and more aware of them, and they're experiencing tragedies of their own. And it's in the news all the time. I mean, every single day you see this, one extreme event or a tragedy being blasted across the television or radio or Reddit or whatever. And I think because of that, they're taking notice more. And as they take notice more, they're appreciating how bad it's getting. And now that these climate bills are in the legislature and people are communicating with their members of Congress more, and people like, CCL, Climate Lobby, is lobbying them every single year, we are making progress to helping the Congress members understand the urgency and the severity of this. So I'm hopeful that we're going to get there. It's just a matter of when. But I think the more pressure that individual US citizens apply to the congressional process, I think that will be the issue that makes it happen. So all of you out there can do your part to making sure that those members of Congress understand this is critical, this is urgent, just like COVID is urgent, and we need to apply the same kinds of approaches, not only in terms of climate change, not only to countrywide, national-wide, but also to the entire globe. And we need a leader. We need a global leader back that is going to help us interact and communicate with the global community to really solve this global climate process.
Yeah, good answer. Totally agree with that. I would say my hope would be that we can learn from coronavirus, because Tom gave us this great summary of how coronavirus and climate change are these very, very similar threats, but coronavirus is happening on much more compressed time frames. So we're kind of seeing like what happens when we deny the problem and then we wait until it's hitting us with impacts before we take action. We saw with the United States, like we got this big spread of coronavirus. And so this is kind of a lesson that we need to take as much action up front to curb the outbreaks before they happen. So exact same thing with climate change. We need to curb our carbon emissions before we see these even more and more severe climate change impacts with extreme weather events and the like. So sometimes we're not so good at learning these kinds of lessons, but we have that opportunity with the coronavirus happening on this compressed time frame to learn this lesson and to apply it to climate change. That we need to take action aggressively and quickly as possible for the best long-term outcome.
Okay, well, we're really at the end of our time today. I want to thank you all for attending our Zoom meeting. Let's all participate in the upcoming 3-day Earth Day event, including the letter writing and the phone calling that will translate our time here into action in building political will. Everyone needs to do their parts. I've posted information on the events in the chat, and there's some links there for everyone. You can access that chat later from the recording. So I hope it was a worthwhile 2 hours of your time. And I'd like to thank you, Dr. Tom Suchanek, for talking about the parallels between COVID-19 and climate change, and for really all the time that you've put in on this presentation. And thank you, Mr. Dana Nuccitelli, for your review of market-based solutions to climate change. And thanks to the Sacramento and Nevada County chapters for co-sponsoring this event. And a big thanks goes out to our friends at Nevada County Media for today's broadcast. This presentation was filmed on April 11th, so the status of the COVID-19 virus may have changed in the interim, but the data on climate change is still ongoing as it has for the last many decades. In addition to this presentation today, it will be rebroadcast by Nevada County Media on Comcast Cable 11 and Suddenly Cable 16, as well as on the Facebook pages of the Sacramento and Nevada County chapters. So remember, it's always a good time to write or call your Congress member about climate change.